Welcome to Buried Truths, where the dust of time is swept away and history's deepest secrets rise to the surface. The Watergate scandal did not begin with the break-in at the Democratic National Committee headquarters. Its roots went much deeper into the political climate of the late 1960s and early 1970s. The United States was going through a period of tremendous turmoil, with the Vietnam War raging overseas and civil unrest spreading across American cities. President Richard Nixon rose to power promising law and order, appealing to what he called the silent majority of Americans who were tired of protests and social upheaval. Nixon, a Republican, had lost the presidential election in 1960 to John F. Kennedy in one of the closest races in American history. This defeat left a deep scar on Nixon's political psyche. He believed that the media and political elites were biased against him, and this belief would shape much of his presidency. After a political comeback by winning the California governorship bid failed in 1962, Nixon declared, "You won't have Nixon to kick around anymore," but soon re-emerged on the national stage. In 1968, Nixon won the presidency by capitalizing on widespread dissatisfaction with the Democratic Party, the chaos of the 1968 Democratic National Convention in Chicago, and fears of crime and disorder. His campaign emphasized a strong stance against crime, communism, and domestic unrest. Once in office, Nixon was determined to secure his power and eliminate any threats to his administration, real or imagined. As the Vietnam War dragged on, Nixon's administration faced mounting criticism. In 1971, the leak of the Pentagon Papers, a classified study of the Vietnam War, fueled Nixon's paranoia. Although the papers mainly embarrassed previous administrations, Nixon feared future leaks could expose sensitive information about his own actions. To combat this perceived threat, Nixon's team created a secret group known as the White House Plumbers, tasked with stopping leaks and gathering intelligence against perceived enemies. The Plumbers, made up of former CIA and FBI agents, quickly expanded their activities beyond preventing leaks. They began spying on political opponents, organizing break-ins, and conducting dirty tricks campaigns. Nixon's inner circle, including aides like H.R. Haldeman, John Ehrlichman, and Charles Colson, fostered a culture of loyalty and secrecy, where illegal activities were rationalized as necessary for the survival of the presidency. Nixon also formed the Committee to Re-elect the President, known by its ironic acronym CREEP for his 1972 re-election campaign. Officially a fundraising organization, CREEP also became deeply involved in political espionage and sabotage against Democratic opponents. The aggressive tactics were designed to ensure Nixon's landslide re-election victory. The atmosphere in the White House grew increasingly toxic, driven by distrust of the press, the Democrats, and even elements within the government itself. Nixon installed a secret taping system in the White House to record conversations, believing these recordings would provide an accurate account of his presidency and protect him against his enemies. By early 1972, the Nixon administration had created a shadowy network of operatives working outside traditional legal boundaries. They believed they were protecting national security and the president's political future. However, these operations would ultimately spiral out of control. The political climate leading up to the Watergate break-in was thus characterized by paranoia, secrecy, and a willingness to abuse presidential power. Nixon's determination to control political outcomes at any cost set the stage for one of the greatest scandals in American history. His distrustful and combative style of leadership would not only destroy his presidency, but also shake the very foundations of American democracy. The Watergate scandal would reveal how a president's fear of opposition, combined with an obsession for power, could lead to a massive abuse of authority. It all began long before 5 men broke into the Watergate office complex on a quiet June night in 1972. In the early hours of June 17, 1972, 5 men were arrested inside the Democratic National Committee, DNC headquarters at the Watergate office complex in Washington, D.C. They were caught attempting to wiretap phones and steal documents. The men were carrying cameras, bugging equipment, and large amounts of cash. Initially, the burglary seemed like a minor incident, but it would soon unravel into a political scandal of unprecedented scale. The 5 burglars, James W. McCord, Frank Sturgis, Virgilio Gonzalez, Eugenio Martinez, and Bernard Barker, were not ordinary criminals. They had connections to the CIA and anti-Castro Cuban groups. James McCord was the security coordinator for the Committee to Re-elect the President, CREEP, directly linking the burglary to Nixon's campaign organization. The purpose of the break-in was to install listening devices on telephones and gather intelligence on the Democratic Party's strategy for the 1972 presidential election. This was not the first attempt. A previous break-in had been partially successful, but the operatives needed to fix faulty wiretaps and collect more information. They returned on June 17th to complete the job, but were caught by a security guard, Frank Wills, who noticed suspicious activity and called the police. When the burglars were arrested, they were dressed in business suits and carried sequentially numbered $100 bills, suggesting a coordinated professional operation. Initially, the Nixon administration and CREEP officials dismissed the incident as a third-rate burglary with no ties to the White House. However, investigative journalists, especially Bob Woodward and Woodward Bernstein of the Washington Post, began uncovering connections between the burglars and high-ranking officials. As investigations proceeded, it became clear that G. Gordon Liddy and E. Howard Hunt, former government operatives working for CREEP, had orchestrated the break-in. Liddy and Hunt had organized a series of illegal activities known as Operation Gemstone, which included not just surveillance, but also plans for political sabotage against Democrats. The arrested men remained silent at first, refusing to reveal who had ordered the break-in. Behind the scenes, efforts were made to buy their silence using money raised by CREEP. White House officials, including John Mitchell, who had recently resigned as Attorney General to head CREEP, tried to distance themselves from the operation. The initial court proceedings revealed little. Prosecutors treated the case as a simple burglary without political implications. However, Judge John Sirica, who presided over the trial, suspected a larger conspiracy. He pressured the defendants by offering reduced sentences in exchange for testimony. James McCord eventually broke ranks, writing a letter to Sirica that implicated higher-level officials in the planning and cover-up of the Watergate break-in. Meanwhile, Nixon's aides continued to deny any involvement. Publicly, the president expressed outrage at the break-in and insisted that the White House had no role in it. Privately, efforts were made to obstruct the investigation. The FBI's probe into the burglary was hindered by orders from top administration officials to limit their inquiries. Despite the White House's efforts, the connection between the burglars, CREEP, and Nixon's inner circle grew harder to hide. By the end of 1972, several reporters, judges, and members of Congress were questioning the official story. Yet Nixon was overwhelmingly re-elected in November 1972, winning 49 out of 50 states against Democratic challenger George McGovern. The break-in at the Watergate complex was initially viewed as a minor event in a fiercely competitive election year. However, it would not fade away. Instead, it ignited a slow-burning fuse that would eventually explode into a full-scale political crisis. The Watergate scandal was no longer just about a burglary. It was about a systematic abuse of power at the highest levels of government. The unraveling of the Watergate break-in would set off a chain of investigations, revelations, and political consequences that no one in June 1972 could have imagined. What seemed like a clumsy act of political espionage was the first visible crack in the facade of Nixon's administration. As the investigation into the Watergate break-in gathered momentum, President Richard Nixon and his closest advisors quickly moved to contain the damage. Their immediate goal was to prevent any direct link between the burglars and the White House. What followed was a complex and deliberate cover-up operation that would ultimately prove more damaging than the crime itself. Just days after the arrests, White House Chief of Staff H.R. Haldeman and Domestic Affairs Advisor John Ehrlichman discussed. strategies to block the FBI's investigation. They decided to falsely claim that national security concerns were at stake, urging the CIA to instruct the FBI to halt its inquiry into Creep's financial activities. This intervention, known as the smoking gun conversation, would later be a pivotal piece of evidence against Nixon. To keep the burglars silent, funds were funneled to them through intermediaries. Secret payments totaling more than $400,000 were made to ensure their cooperation and silence. These hush money payments were organized by key Nixon aides, including John Dean, the White House counsel, who became a central figure in the unfolding scandal. Meanwhile, the Nixon administration engaged in a public relations campaign to downplay the break-in. Press Secretary Ron Ziegler famously dismissed the burglary as a third-rate operation and accused the media of trying to create a political crisis where none existed. Nixon, for his part, continued to publicly deny any involvement while privately orchestrating efforts to derail investigations. In October 1972, Nixon fired two top aides, G. Gordon Liddy and E. Howard Hunt, to create the appearance that the scandal was limited to a few rogue operatives. However, the Washington Post's relentless reporting, based largely on information from an anonymous source known as Deep Throat, revealed that the cover-up extended deep into the administration. As pressure mounted, Nixon authorized the creation of a secret White House investigative unit known as the Plumbers. Originally established to stop or retaliate against leaks of classified information, such as the Pentagon Papers, the Plumbers were repurposed to manage the growing Watergate fallout. Their tactics included break-ins, surveillance, and other illegal activities designed to protect the president and his re-election campaign. Behind closed doors, Nixon discussed using government agencies like the IRS, the FBI, and the CIA to harass political opponents and thwart investigations. Tapes of these conversations, recorded secretly in the Oval Office, would later provide undeniable evidence of Nixon's personal involvement in the obstruction of justice. Throughout late 1972 and early 1973, the cover-up seemed to be working. Nixon began his second term with a landslide mandate, and public attention waned. However, cracks were beginning to appear. Several key figures, including James McCord and John Dean, grew uneasy with the extent of the deception and the pressure to continue lying under oath. In March 1973, James McCord wrote a letter to Judge John Sirica, exposing the perjury and political pressure surrounding the case. McCord's revelations breathed new life into the investigations and led to the establishment of the Senate Watergate Committee. Realizing the cover-up was collapsing, John Dean sought immunity in exchange for his testimony. He revealed to investigators that there had been a cancer growing on the presidency and detailed Nixon's role in obstructing justice. Dean's cooperation marked a turning point in the scandal, bringing the investigation directly to the Oval Office. The Senate Watergate hearings, broadcast live on television, exposed the full extent of the administration's wrongdoing to the American public. For the first time, millions of Americans witnessed former White House aides testifying about the lies, bribes, and abuses of power orchestrated by Nixon and his inner circle. The cover-up, initially seen as a means of survival, had become a trap. Each new revelation peeled away the layers of deceit, revealing a presidency consumed by paranoia, secrecy, and criminal behavior. Nixon's strategy of denying, diverting, and destroying evidence had backfired spectacularly. By mid-1973, it was no longer a question of whether Nixon's administration had engaged in wrongdoing. It was a question of how deep the corruption ran and whether the president himself could survive the political and legal consequences that now loomed on the horizon. As the Senate Watergate Committee intensified its investigation in mid-1973, one revelation sent shockwaves across Washington: the existence of a secret taping system in the White House. During a routine questioning, Alexander Butterfield, a former deputy assistant to Nixon, disclosed that President Nixon had installed a system that automatically recorded all conversations and phone calls in the Oval Office and other key locations. This admission was explosive. The tapes were believed to contain direct evidence of Nixon's involvement in the Watergate cover-up. Immediately, both the Senate committee and Special Prosecutor Archibald Cox demanded access to these recordings. Nixon, however, refused, citing executive privilege and national security concerns. His refusal set off a constitutional battle over the limits of presidential power. As pressure mounted, Nixon offered a compromise. He would provide written summaries of the tapes rather than the tapes themselves. However, the Senate committee and Cox rejected this, insisting on the original recordings. Nixon's stonewalling only deepened suspicions of his guilt. On October 20th, 1973, a dramatic confrontation known as the Saturday Night Massacre unfolded. Nixon ordered Attorney General Elliot Richardson to fire Special Prosecutor Cox. Richardson refused and resigned in protest. His deputy, William Ruckelshaus, also refused and was likewise dismissed. Finally, Solicitor General Robert Bork carried out Nixon's order and fired Cox. The public reacted with outrage. Thousands of citizens flooded Congress with calls and telegrams demanding Nixon's impeachment. Political support for the president, even among Republicans, began to erode rapidly. The House of Representatives initiated an impeachment inquiry, and the new special prosecutor, Leon Jaworski, renewed demands for the tapes. Despite his resistance, Nixon eventually released a series of edited transcripts in April 1974. These transcripts revealed a presidency obsessed with enemies, riddled with vulgar language, and actively engaged in plots to sabotage investigations. Yet crucial conversations, including the so-called smoking gun tape, were either heavily redacted or missing entirely. One glaring omission was an 18-12-minute gap in a recording of a conversation between Nixon and H.R. Haldeman just days after the Watergate break-in. When questioned, Nixon's secretary, Rose Mary Woods, claimed she had accidentally erased part of the tape while transcribing it. The explanation was widely ridiculed and further damaged Nixon's credibility. Release of the transcripts made it clear that Nixon had participated in the Watergate cover-up from the beginning. Public trust in the presidency collapsed. Editorials across the nation called for his resignation or impeachment. In July 1974, the Supreme Court delivered a unanimous ruling in United States v. Nixon, ordering the president to turn over the full, unedited tapes to the special prosecutor. The court decisively rejected Nixon's claims of absolute executive privilege, affirming that no person, not even the president, is above the law. When the tapes were finally released, they provided undeniable evidence of Nixon's active role in obstructing justice. The smoking gun tape from June 23, 1972, captured Nixon instructing Haldeman to have the CIA pressure the FBI to stop its investigation into Watergate, exactly the act of obstruction investigators had been seeking to prove. Following this revelation, Republican leaders, including Senator Barry Goldwater and House Minority Leader John Rhodes, met with Nixon. They informed him that he had lost the support of Congress and would be impeached and convicted if he tried to remain in office. Facing certain impeachment and removal, Richard Nixon announced his resignation on August 8, 1974, in a televised address to the nation. He declared that he was resigning for the good of the country, emphasizing that he had always acted in what he believed were the best interests of the United States. The next day, August 9, 1974, Nixon departed the White House for the last time. As president, Gerald Ford was sworn in shortly after, declaring, "Our long national nightmare is over." The Watergate scandal not only ended Nixon's presidency, but also left a lasting scar on American political life. It deepened public cynicism toward government and led to reforms aimed at restoring transparency and accountability. However, it also exposed how easily power could be abused at the highest levels, a lesson that continues to resonate in American democracy. The resignation of President Richard Nixon on August 9, 1974, marked an unprecedented moment in American history. It was the first time a sitting U.S. president had resigned from office. As Nixon left the White House aboard Marine One, the nation watched in a mix of shock, relief, and deep uncertainty about the future of its democracy. Gerald Ford, upon taking the oath of office, immediately sought to calm the nation. In his inaugural address, he famously stated, "Our long national nightmare is over." Ford emphasized the need for healing and unity, but he also inherited a deeply fractured country, suspicious of government and skeptical of its leaders. One of Ford's most controversial decisions came just a month later, on September 8, 1974, when he granted Nixon a full, unconditional pardon for any crimes he might have committed while in office. Ford argued that prolonging Nixon's legal troubles would only deepen the national divide and delay healing. However, the pardon was deeply unpopular and fueled public outrage, with many Americans feeling that justice had been denied. Ford's approval ratings plummeted, and the pardon likely contributed to his defeat in the 1976 presidential election. Meanwhile, the legal consequences of Watergate rippled through Washington. Many of Nixon's closest aides and advisors were prosecuted and convicted. H.R. Haldeman, John Ehrlichman, and John Mitchell were among those who served prison time for their roles in the scandal. These high-profile convictions demonstrated that even the most powerful were not above the law, reinforcing the importance of accountability in government. Congress responded to the abuses of power revealed by Watergate with a series of sweeping reforms designed to restore public trust and prevent future abuses. The Federal Election Campaign Act was amended to establish stricter regulations on campaign financing, including limits on contributions and requirements for greater transparency. The creation of the Federal Election Commission, FEC, ensured that these laws would be enforced independently. The Privacy Act of 1974 was another major legislative response. It was designed to regulate the collection, maintenance, and use of personal information by federal agencies, protecting citizens from unwarranted government intrusion. Similarly, the Freedom of Information Act, FOIA, was strengthened, giving citizens greater access to government records and promoting transparency. Congress also enacted the Ethics in Government Act in 1978, which required public officials to disclose their financial interests, and created procedures for appointing independent prosecutors to investigate allegations of misconduct against high-ranking government officials. This was directly influenced by the Watergate experience, where executive branch misconduct had gone unchecked for too long. The scandal also profoundly changed the relationship between the media and the presidency. Journalists, inspired by the groundbreaking investigative work of Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein of The Washington Post, became more aggressive in their scrutiny of political leaders. The press, often referred to as the Fourth Estate, embraced its role as a watchdog of democracy, ensuring that no official could operate beyond public scrutiny. Public cynicism toward political institutions, however, remained deeply entrenched. Surveys conducted in the years following Watergate showed a dramatic decline in trust in government. Where once Americans had largely believed in the honesty and competence of their leaders, now skepticism and doubt became widespread, influencing political discourse for generations. The Republican Party also suffered significant setbacks in the immediate aftermath. In the 1974 midterm elections, Democrats gained a large number of seats in both the House and Senate, a phenomenon referred to as the Watergate babies class of lawmakers. These newly elected officials pushed for reforms aimed at increasing transparency and limiting executive power. Despite the darkness of the scandal, Watergate ultimately reaffirmed key principles of American democracy: that no person, not even the president, is above the law, that the separation of powers must be preserved, and that the press and public vigilance are essential to the health of the republic. In the decades since Watergate, its lessons have remained a touchstone for American political life. Whenever allegations of presidential misconduct arise, comparisons to Watergate are inevitable. The suffix "gate" has even become shorthand for political scandals around the world. Watergate was not merely a political scandal, it was a crisis of constitutional governance that tested the resilience of American institutions. In surviving it, the United States demonstrated the strength of its democratic system, though it also revealed vulnerabilities that required constant vigilance to protect. Ultimately, the aftermath of Watergate reshaped American politics, law, and society in profound ways, leaving a legacy that continues to shape the nation's understanding of power, accountability, and democracy. As time passed, the direct consequences of the Watergate scandal seemed to fade from the headlines, but its legacy remained deeply ingrained in American politics and public consciousness. The scandal set a precedent for political accountability, but it also underscored the dangers of unchecked executive power. In the years following Watergate, Americans would continue to grapple with the lessons it taught, applying its principles to future scandals and political events. One of the most significant long-term impacts of Watergate was the shift in how the American public viewed the presidency. The idea of an imperial presidency, where the president's power was almost limitless, was dealt a heavy blow. The scandal revealed that even the highest office in the land could be corrupted by greed and ambition. The concept of presidential authority was redefined with an increasing emphasis on the need for transparency, checks, and balances. Watergate also left an indelible mark on the political landscape, influencing the public's relationship with the government. For years after the scandal, trust in political leaders remained at an all-time low. Public opinion polls consistently showed that the American people were disillusioned with the political system, feeling that corruption and dishonesty were pervasive throughout government institutions. The media's role in exposing Watergate had a lasting effect as well. The investigative journalism that led to the downfall of the Nixon administration set a new standard for the press. Journalists began to view their role not just as reporters of news, but as watchdogs of democracy. This change was not without its controversies. As the press became more aggressive, accusations of bias and sensationalism followed. Nonetheless, the media's role in exposing corruption was cemented, and investigative reporting became an essential part of political journalism. In terms of legal reforms, the aftermath of Watergate led to a wave of laws and regulations aimed at increasing accountability in government. The Ethics in Government Act of 1978, which established procedures for appointing independent counsels to investigate executive branch misconduct, was a direct response to the failures revealed by Watergate. This law became a cornerstone of the post-Watergate era, reinforcing the idea that no one, not even the president, was above the law. Similarly, the passage of the Federal Election Campaign Act amendments, which placed stricter limits on campaign contributions and expenditures, was another key reform resulting from the scandal. These laws were designed to curb the influence of money in politics, a problem that was at the heart of the Watergate scandal. By creating more transparency in campaign financing, the reforms aimed to restore public trust in the political process. While the legal landscape changed in response to Watergate, the political consequences were also felt in elections. The Republican Party, tainted by the scandal, faced a difficult road to recovery. The 1974 midterm elections were disastrous for the GOP, with the Democratic Party gaining a significant number of seats. This period marked the rise of a new generation of lawmakers, often referred to as the Watergate babies, who were determined to push for reforms and ensure that the mistakes of the past were not repeated. In the long run, the scandal played a role in the erosion of political partisanship in the United States. While Watergate was largely a Republican scandal, its consequences were felt across the political spectrum. In the years following, both parties would be held to higher standards of accountability. This shift was especially evident in the 1980s and beyond, as both Democratic and Republican administrations faced scrutiny for their actions in office. The long-term effects of Watergate were also evident in the changing dynamics of American political culture. The scandal reinforced the idea that the American people had the power to hold their leaders accountable. It demonstrated that even the most powerful figures in government could be brought down if they violated the public's trust. This shift in attitude contributed to a more active, more cynical electorate, one that was more willing to challenge the authority of its leaders. Watergate also had a profound impact on the way future political scandals were viewed. The term "gate" has become shorthand for political scandals around the world, from Iran-Contra to the Clinton impeachment to the 2016 email controversy involving Hillary Clinton. Each new scandal inevitably invites comparisons to Watergate, with the media, politicians, and the public drawing parallels between past and present abuses of power. The Watergate scandal also influenced the way presidents interacted with the media and the public. In the years following Nixon's resignation, presidents became more cautious in their public statements and more wary of being exposed. The idea of spin and media management became central to presidential campaigns as candidates sought to avoid the pitfalls that had brought down Nixon. The media's increasing role in shaping political narratives forced future presidents to become more adept at managing their image. Despite the reforms and changes in public attitudes, Watergate's legacy remains a cautionary tale. The scandal showed that no political leader is beyond reproach, and that even the highest levels of government can be susceptible to corruption. Watergate has become a symbol of the fragility of American democracy and the need for constant vigilance to protect the integrity of its institutions. Conclusion: Watergate's impact on American politics, law, and society cannot be overstated. The lessons learned from the scandal shaped the political landscape for generations, reinforcing the importance of transparency, accountability, and the separation of powers. Though the immediate consequences of Watergate have long since faded, its lessons continue to resonate, reminding Americans of the importance of safeguarding their democracy from abuse and corruption. If you're passionate about uncovering the forgotten stories of our past, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell. Don't forget to like the video if you're enjoying the journey so far, and stay tuned, because there's so much more history waiting to be unearthed right here on Buried Truths.